the main topic of conversation is now not just who is the most credible to carry out mass deportations of illegal immigrants and uphold the law and move criminal foreign nationals from our country, but it's also how do we encourage lots of people who have not joined our national tribe, who have not fostered good relationships with us, who will not reproduce our civilization. How do we encourage those people to leave our country, go back to their own countries, hopefully build those up, we can check on in them in a few hundred years, but leave us in peace and prosperity. Thank you very much.
Is Islam compatible with Britain?
Well, 53% of the British public, according to a recent poll published in The Telegraph, do not seem to think so. When asked, is Islam compatible with British values, I would prefer to use the term traditions, because that's a living thing. They said no, and that's been quite the taboo for our politicians to talk about for many decades across all parties, but I think ever since Elon Musk amplified the Pakistani grooming gang story to a global scale and then made it an unavoidable issue for Labour, people have started to realise that there are hostile communities in our country who do not think the same way as we do. They do not have the same individualistic ethic that is born out of Britain's common law tradition, its Christian faith, and its nuclearized family structure. And we've had this going back to the Middle Ages, where the average age of marriage was, in its 20s, where in other parts of the world it was still common for older men to marry children, for siblings to marry one another, to cousins to marry one another, and that still persists in the world today. There's been great work by an Oxford scholar called Patrick Nash looking into the case for banning cousin marriage, and he notes that in parts of the Islamic world, cousin marriage is still between like 40 and 80%, and it's still quite high in the Pakistani Biradiri clans that populate various towns and cities like Bradford, Luton, Blackburn, across the UK. And so what this means is a clannish mentality, a us versus them mentality, is entrenched by family structure and by faith. And I say faith because Islam mapped onto the existing clannish structures of 7th century Arabia and created a kind of super clan, an ummah, which united all of these families under one banner, one Muslim race. And so it extended the remit of moral consideration beyond just the family, beyond just the clan, but to fellow Muslims. But unfortunately, not to other faiths. There are multiple verses in the Quran and Hadith where Muhammad says that you should not make common cause or friends with Jews and Christians. You should strike at the necks of unbelievers where you find them. You should subject them to a jizya, kind of protection tax, rendering them second-class citizens. That was imposed upon Jewish tribes in Medina when Muhammad made the hijrah, the migration from Mecca to Medina, found them in their own lands. They rejected him as a prophet and Messiah, and he said, right, well, we will subject these people to harsh and violent penalties for being apostates, for being enemies of Allah. And so if this mentality that you can't make friends with people outside your family, your clan, your faith, and your ummah persists in these areas in Britain, as documented by Muslims themselves, like Ed Hussein in the book Among the Mosques, then it's hard to say that we can have the same civilization if we keep inputting this mentality, this theory of mind, this faith into our country, and the demographic grows where now Muhammad is the most common baby name for newborns in Britain. I think it means that we're going to have a deeply culturally unrecognizable nation if this trend continues.
What I'm trying to say is there's lots of moderate Muslims who people would say, look, they don't believe this stuff that you're talking about. They are, basically integrated into British society, and they don't view us as all evil infidels. They want to slit our throats or something.
So Ed Hussein holds this opinion himself, a second-generation immigrant and Muslim, but he estimates as a former jihadist that about 3% of the global population themselves are jihadists. He used caliphists, the people that want to see the reconstruction of the caliphate. Given the Muslim population, that's still 50 million people worldwide, and we're currently importing lots of them from the third world, from the Muslim world, and not exactly screening them for their views at the border. So we are undoubtedly importing and home-growing jihadists. I would say we don't want to risk our entire civilization on hoping that they are the moderate mystic sect, the much smaller sect of Islam, than their Sunni or Shia or Salafist counterparts, and hope that they just don't read their own texts too closely. People might hear Sunni, Shia, Khalifist, Salafist rather. Salafists are the counterpart to the Sufis. This means that they want to live as closely and authentically a life akin to the Prophet Muhammad from the 7th century. So they wage a war on what they call fitna, and this is a word meaning temptation, occasions to sin. So everything from going on social media and in mixed-sex spaces to pornography, alcohol, shaking hands with women. All of these things are to be crusaded against, to commit jihad against. And jihad, if you look at the root word in the Quran, is most associated with either violence, so fighting, or militias, fighters, the mushahadeen. That's where it crops up most commonly. So there should be a jihad against all temptations to sin, which actually means that lots of British-born Western Muslims who live in segregated enclaves see the Western society around them. And this can be a further cause of radicalisation. This is what Ayaan Hirsi Ali in her book Heretic calls cocooning. And the only way to, if they have been westernized and they revert back to the faith, the only way to absolve themselves of sin is something like a jihadist attack, a suicide bombing. It's not like in the Christian tradition where you have things like confession or forgiveness. It's more that you need to demonstrate your submission to the faith. And this is why caliphate, the belief in the caliphate coming, is so prominent among even second-generation British-born Muslims. We saw the Henry Jackson Society polling, which is very pessimistic, because it says 52% want to ban depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, a third want Sharia law and Islam to become the dominant religion in the UK, and up to three-quarters of them believe that Hamas did nothing wrong on October 7th when they committed those heinous crimes, those genocidal acts against Jews. And that's most common among 18 to 30 aged, university-educated, British-born Muslims, which means we've got a cross-generational radicalisation problem. And the Muslim community elders themselves are not helping with this. We've had Dr. Taj Hargey speak to Martin Daubney on GB News about how mosques and madrasas are preaching to Muslim men to see white women and girls as second-class citizens because of their supposed sexual promiscuity by Islamic standards, and so this has fed into things like the grooming gangs, or just generally disparaging views of their British host majority neighbours. And also, we've seen in Ed Hussein's book that no matter whether or not you're a Sunni or a Shia, that the difference being that both of them want a caliphate, but the Shias believe that a 12th century descendant of Muhammad is going to be sort of come back, reincarnated, and act as Messiah to actually lead the caliphate properly. It's kind of like a family feud, really. No matter what dynamic you fall alongside, the Muslim community elders feel either sufficiently compromised by the more radical elements of their mosques, or they themselves are just biding their time and waiting to fold themselves into the caliphate, that when Ed in his book pressed a prominent pseudonymized Bradford Muslim on whether or not a caliphate is coming, he said that, well, I just tell my congregation, bide your time, learn your Quran, get good jobs, enter the office of state, and eventually the caliphate will come. And so if we have a population, whether violently or even peacefully awaiting the day that our country becomes politically, demographically, religiously unrecognizable, I don't see how we can make peace or even common cause with that. Because final note, I have seen members on the right, whether it's Tucker Carlson or even just some Christians that I've spoke to that are more concerned with the rise of secularism than they are with Islam in our country. They think that Muslims are our natural allies because they're conservative on things like trans issues and sex education in schools. That's just not the case, because if you might have a common enemy in one moment, but if you play out their ethos, as we can see in all the Muslim countries around the world, you might luck out and get a civilization like Abu Dhabi, which means you can live there relatively peacefully as a non-Muslim, or you might get someone like Pakistan or Yemen, and either way, you don't get Britain.
Do you think there's been a certain naivety, or is it an ignorance around Islam and Muslims, and when it comes to mass migration into the West, from both conservatives and liberals who have supported this, who've welcomed them with open arms, who view Islam as the religion of peace, and basically they can integrate into our societies no problem. And okay, there's a few extremists, but the vast majority are equivalent to you and I in terms of culture and moral outlook.
Yeah, we've had a lot of politicians like Theresa May saying they have a favourite Quran verse, or not long after the September 11 attacks, 9/11 in 2001, George Bush couldn't understand, famously, why they hate us, why they fight us. Islam means peace. We want exactly the same thing. And a lot of this is premised on the anthropology of the blank slate, the idea that deep down we are fundamentally all the same, that we're just fungible units driven apart by having to have been born in a different country or subjected to a different education system, or not being as economically prosperous as one another, often by the injustices of colonialism, racism, and empire. And that means that the state can rectify these injustices if it just brings all these people into one place. If it lowers a few Union Jacks, puts up a few Palestine flags, and doesn't offend the newcomers, then we'll all become this sort of indistinguishable grey goo tribe singing John Lennon's Imagine. And unfortunately, this unilateral multiculturalism inflicted upon the British people has not been to their benefit. They've never asked for it. And because of the violence emanating from certain sects of Islam that are disproportionately present in Britain. For example, the Blair government even observed that the majority of Britain's mosques are Deobandi sects. This comes from Deoband in the 19th century, an area just outside of Delhi in India that tried to resist the British Empire and so fostered a certain sect of Islam that is specifically having an ethnic and historical grudge against the British people. That is the majority of Britain's mosques, unfortunately, largely due to foreign funding and foreign trained imams as well. I think people fail to understand that this unilateral multiculturalism has disarmed the British in having an identity that is sufficiently strong and incorporative to the few handful of people that do want to come along and join our national tribe, to push back on this ideology, this political faith that has imperial designs on our country and doesn't like us because we are apostates, because we are ethnically outside of the Ummah, and because we will not submit to their final revelation. And if I may, the final thing I will say is that they fail to grasp a theory of mind of just how even peaceful, moderate Muslims just have different cultural practices to us. So Ayaan Hirsi Ali, when she was an interpreter in the Netherlands, she would explain how Somali families would frequently litter or are late to places or allow their children to run riot. And when they were challenged on this, they would say, Inshallah, it's God's will. And the belief is that everything is predetermined because Allah is all-powerful, He is all-knowing, He set the universe into motion. And so there's a kind of fatalism that creeps in. There's the inability to plan for the long term. There's the unwillingness to maintain privacy or public hygiene in public spaces. And so it just creates a very different, lower trust, dysfunctional civilization that we, the British, it's not ergonomic to us, and it's not the kind of civilization I want to raise my kids in.
When it comes to the solution to some of these problems you're talking about, obviously we know that we have millions of Muslims across the West, particularly in Western Europe. What are the solutions? What are the policy solutions? What are the policy levers that we can pull if you're Farage, if you're Rupert Lowe, if you're whoever? You know, I'm assuming you want to ban halal, I'm assuming you want to copy the French ban on the burqa. Of course, there have been some issues with both of those policies in Europe where, you try and ban halal, and they'll just import it from somewhere else, or they'll go around it in some other way. Try and ban the burqa, and that has its own issues in France, where I don't think that's been particularly effective at discouraging Muslims. There's still a huge Muslim population in France, and ever growing. So yeah, talk about some of those policy solutions and maybe some of the challenges that you might pose.
So I would agree with those policy solutions. However, they're only ever dealing with second-order effects, which is you don't need to pick up the pieces of a fragmented culture if you aren't driving the demographic fodder that causes these problems in the first place. So we should close our doors to the Muslim world. Just as Trump has placed sensible travel bans on Muslim countries with a propensity for terrorism, we should have an immigration red list that says we want to discriminate via not just economics, not just numbers, but by cultural compatibility. And so historically, Western Europe, parts of Eastern Europe that are Christian and very anti-communist these days, Japan, South Korea, Israel, the United States, the Anglosphere, they all might be compatible in limited numbers to come over, get married, contribute to the economy. We might be happy to have some of those people here, but the rest of the world, no, we must shut our doors to them. As far as dealing with those cultural practices, I think they would constitute a sufficient deterrent to encourage some people to leave, and you'd need to pair that with removing indefinite leave to remain. You'd need to pair that with removing the subsidies that the likes of the Conservatives and Keir Starmer have provided to Britain's mosques, not just round-the-clock security, but financing Islamic charities, including things like the Muslim Council of Britain, who are meant to have a Whitehall engagement ban placed upon them, but ministers of both parties have been to their dinners. I think we should stop subsidising the stay of economically unproductive people in the Pakistani and Bangladeshi community who cannot pay their own way, who subsist in social housing, who live off child benefit. I mean, don't forget, the Manchester Arena bombers' parents were continuing to receive social housing and benefits even after they returned to Libya. Like, why are we paying for people to be in this country that not only don't contribute something, but actively harm our children, our women, our family members? I think it's abhorrent. I think all of this is on the table now, that especially Elon Musk has kind of thrown a brick through Britain's Overton window by just saying remigration is a necessary policy. Now, we can call it what we like. I know that term has been used by parties and fringe figures with checkered pasts, and so people, even if they support the spirit of the policy, they've refrained from using it. But the main topic of conversation is now not just who is the most credible to carry out mass deportations of illegal immigrants and uphold the law and remove criminal foreign nationals from our country. But it's also, how do we encourage lots of people who have not joined our national tribe, who have not fostered good relationships with us, who will not reproduce our civilization? How do we encourage those people to leave our country, go back to their own countries, hopefully build those up, we can check on them in a few hundred years, but leave us in peace and prosperity? Thank you very much.
What about the argument from some who say that, look, Muslims and other immigrants, they make Britain a nicer place, they make Britain a more interesting place, they make us more diverse, which is a strength, of course. That's what Rishi Sunak famously held up that little coin. They give us fantastic cuisine, food, and we've basically got this mundane kind of stale, pale, male island.
As James Cleverly once said.
As James Cleverly once used that phrase. And importing people from around the world makes Britain more interesting and colourful and fantastic.
I do not have such a low opinion of my country and my culture. If I wanted to sample foreign cuisine, as Rowan Atkinson once joked, I think we have the recipes, and so we are more than capable of cooking it for ourselves. This doesn't mean that we need to exclude literally every person of a foreign extraction. It does mean that we can be friendly to those people, but I just don't believe that Britain is a tabula rasa, a kind of empty template on which other cultures, more vibrant and exotic and mysterious cultures, are stitched. And so if people, if the sort of anywheres of the world, in David Goodhart's conception, find other cultures more exotic, and hey, traveling around the world is an Anglo pastime. That's why we did it as part of the empire. It wasn't just morally benevolent for other people, even though it largely was. If they want to visit more exotic locations around the world, okay, travel there or move there. Please stop trying to demographically and culturally terraform my country when the majority of people have never asked for this. And it is very much a luxury belief. Danny Finkelstein wrote in the Times recently that we shouldn't turn to a politics of grievance in retaliation to mass migration. And he said, from his ivory tower, he's a very privileged man, and off his own back, of course, he said that he doesn't understand why people just can't take them as they meet them. Again, he's very individualistic, whereas lots of immigrants are more clannish. And he said that the benefits of mass migration, the benefits of diversity, and diversity only ever means non-native, non-English, foreign, are just obvious goods to him. And that's probably because he has lots of immigrant friends, he goes to lots of posh restaurants, and he lives in a leafy suburb that is relatively homogenous and high trust. This is a classic luxury belief. It is advancing a policy which you will never bear the costs of. And I don't think the victims of the Pakistani grooming gangs would be able to come up with many benefits of diversity that they themselves have lived around. I don't think the people living in Blackburn that told Ed Hussein on the street, there are no-go areas where my sons have been beaten up by Asian gangs, would be able to say the same thing. I don't even think that the various ethnic minority communities that come into clash when it's black and Asian gangs that war over honor and territory would say that importing one group or the other has been particularly beneficial to them. I think that we have heard for many years about how we have an overabundance of racism in our country. Okay, fine. Let's say for the sake of argument that this is the case. I don't think it is, but let's say for the sake of argument it is the case. Then let's not import extra, unnecessary, tribal conflicts and foreign criminals into our country that put the existing people of our country at risk. Because every single crime, every single act of conflict, every single act of cultural degradation committed by an outsider is a choice. It is a policy choice, and that means that it is a policy choice that can be undone, reversed, and sent back.
But don't we have a moral obligation towards our former colonial empire? Because we invaded them, we conquered them, and it's only right that we let those people then come back into Britain, this kind of reverse colonisation. That's literally a phrase that some on the left use. We have this obligation, and also we have an obligation as a Western rich country. We have to help poorer people, we have to open the gates and help the whole world become like us.
Yeah, it's funny that, isn't it? Diversity is a strength until such a time it comes to be a punishment. So there is an ethnic post-colonial grudge that emanates from that part of the world, despite us giving them technologies and advancements and banning practices like sati, burning widows alive for no particular reason other than just pure superstition, preventing members of the lower caste throwing themselves beneath the wheels of the juggernaut statue whenever it's wheeled out once a year, and sacrificing their own children because they think it would get them better karma. I mean, we stopped all these abhorrent practices. We spent more in 60 years to abolish the slave trade around the world than we ever did actually profiting from it in Nigel Biggar's excellent work on colonialism. I don't think that we have a moral obligation to take in the world and its wife, especially when they don't seem particularly grateful to us. Thank you very much. And I don't think there are moral obligations that lie outside the relationships we form. You can't be moral on a desert island. You can only be moral in a relationship with someone else. And if we don't have positive relationships with these countries, with these people, if our generosity is not only not extended to us, but is used as a symbol of weakness, a reason to exploit us, and no matter how generous we are to immigrants and the children of immigrants, we are called racist for not having enough of them in, I don't think we should extend that generosity to the rest of the world. I think, much like Yoram Hazony, the host of this wonderful conference that we're at, I think that nations actually prosper not when they engage in imperial projects on one another. I think they prosper most when each people is given, to the best of their ability, the ability to practice national self-determination, to allow themselves to be a homogenous majority, to practice the culture and faith they like, in isolation, unmolested by the imperial designs of another country. And I think Britain has quite enough immigration, quite enough colonies in its country, and I think that colonialism should be reversed.
Connor Tomlinson, thank you very much.
Pleasure, sir.